This is Jordan West with EPA's Office of Research and Development. I want to welcome those of you who are able to be on the call live today. Thank you so much for joining us. And for those of you listening to this later, welcome to you as well. This is the final webinar. We're going to cover both Activity 2, which corresponds with Lesson 4 of the online course, and we'll talk about wrapping it all up, how it all ties back together in the course conclusion. So recall that for Activity 2, that Lesson 4 module, you learned that Activity 2 helps you identify additional actions to address climate-related vulnerabilities that may not yet be sufficiently addressed in an existing plan. Or in the case of someone who might not have a plan and might be starting from scratch, you could start here to start brainstorming and building a list of potential adaptation actions. We took the case of providing Guanica Bay, Puerto Rico. As you know, you had a vulnerability assessment from there, and we focused on this as a case study for Activity 1. Likewise, for this activity, we asked you to fill in the blank rows of a matrix worksheet to help you do a bit of a gap analysis to see how well a handful of actions that are real actions that were developed by our partners in Guanica Bay, to see how well they cover the 7 strategies covered by the compendium. So here is the matrix, and we provided some filled examples, give an idea of how to do it, and here are our suggestions for the remaining actions. A couple of points I want to make is notice that actions can cover more than one strategy. There's not a one-to-one relationship between actions and strategies. And the second point is that your interpretation of which strategies are covered by an action might be a little bit different, and that can be okay. So in the example of the eliminate invasive lionfish, when you study the compendium, you find reference to dealing with invasive species under a reduce non-climate stresses. But if you're in the restoring structure and function section and you're concerned with key species of the system that might be, for instance, being driven out by an invasive species, you could come up with a suggestion of dealing with an invasive species while thinking of that strategy. Likewise, for mangroves, we can think about the importance of connectivity between mangroves that are adjacent to coral reefs because, for instance, certain fish species spend part of their life cycle in each system, and there needs to be connectivity. And you can consider mangroves a key ecosystem feature that is essential, being an adjacent habitat to the success of coral reefs. So depending on how you're thinking about these actions, you might have put the X's in a slightly different pattern. But the main point here is it's useful to just think from the perspective of every strategy and come up with actions that represent a good variety of coverage of the things that you find in the literature. That's the goal. So the next part of the assignment was to now come up with some new ideas yourself. You had the vulnerability assessment, so you could think about vulnerabilities, and you had the compendium, so you could think about general ideas. And the requirement in worksheet 2 is to identify what is the threat that's maybe not sufficiently covered or could be covered better, and what is a specific version of a general action in the compendium. In other words, the compendium contains some pretty general ideas from the literature that are just tossed out as strategies for adaptation, often not, never place specific because in a lit review, they're just suggestions. So in order to really have actions benefit from being put through the tool, They need to be specific actions, specifically described, and they need to be identified as much as possible with the species or the location or other aspects that are specific to your place. So what we're going to do now is turn it over to Kim McGuire, who's our featured participant guest. Kim's with American Samoa's Department of Marine and Wildlife Resources. She's their climate change coordinator based in American Samoa, and we asked Kim to give activity 2 a try, thinking from the perspective of American Samoa. And so Kim's going to present what she did with the rest of activity 2. So Kim.
All right, thank you so much, Jordan. I found the compendium to be very helpful when doing this activity. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit more about the examples that I've put into this. So we have here in front of us the Guanica Bay watershed examples, and it was good for me to look over these and see how they related to American Samoa as well, with our coastal habitats and our own reefs here. So let's see. We can just discuss Guanica Bay's examples here, and then let's jump into American Samoa. So one of our priority watersheds in American Samoa is Fanga'alu Bay, and it's a highly populated area. There's also a hospital in the area, and also a very big rock quarry. So it's the Fanga'alu rock quarry, and there was a lot of sediment coming from this quarry for a while, and it was a major priority for us to make sure that we reduce this non-climate stress from the quarry. So you can see here that I plugged that in, and a major action that we took was creating settling ponds to minimize the loadings of sediment and nutrients, and that's proven to be very effective. All the excessive sediment has kind of been settled in these ponds. Another thing that I looked into was protecting the key ecosystem features, and a species that I really focus on is parrotfish. Herbivorous fish like parrotfish are key for the livelihood of the reef and American Samoa population. So focused on that and how we can prevent overfishing. And let's see. It's important that we keep those around because of the issues with algae. And let's see. Another one that I addressed is restoring structure and function. Let's see. We use ox bile injections to control crown of thorns starfish. And what was really helpful about this whole exercise was the thought process that kind of gets combed through with using these activity sheets, these worksheets. We were talking about how the crown of thorns outbreak started in American Samoa. We had a huge tsunami in 2009, which brought a lot of nutrients into the water and allowed the crown of thorns to just thrive because of all the nutrients. And since then, we've taken an active stance in trying to control them. And what we do is we use ox bile injections to control these outbreaks. We basically find the individual crown of thorns, and then we inject them with ox bile. And another one is we're looking into protecting the refugia by creating large managed areas. This way we can provide a place for the fish to repopulate without the stresses of heat and other things brought on by climate change. Another one is we're looking into establishing coral nurseries for outplanting of acropora. This goes under the relocating of organisms. And yeah, that's basically what I saw would be useful for Fanga'alu Bay. And it was really helpful to use the compendium just to refer to. And this was a good exercise.
Kim, can I ask you a quick question?
Any questions?
Jordan.
Sure.
You said that you're looking into establishing coral nurseries. So is this something that isn't set up yet? Is this something that basically is going to require whole new infrastructure and approvals and something that's not currently something you're doing, or is this something you've already got going?
We have a coral nursery in another village on the other side of the island, in the village called Leone, and it's still in the experimental phase. It hasn't necessarily produced a lot of coral to be outplanted, but we see that it could be very useful and effective if we can get it going properly, so that we can use it in multiple villages, including Whanga'alu.
Great.
Yeah, so these are all great possibilities that we're looking into, and it's great to use these worksheets to kind of bring it out. So yeah, I liked using this. Okay, so then we went back to the matrix worksheet and we added new actions to see how our strategy coverage is improving. Can go on to the next slide. So we still see some examples here from Guanica Bay up on top. And American Samoa has our highlighted actions here at the bottom in blue. And there you can see the columns that they were effective. I was pretty pleased when I saw this to see that a lot of the actions stretched across the board, and I wouldn't have really thought that it would have accomplished all these different actions unless I saw it laid out like this. So this is great. So some columns had more than others, but it looks like it was a really good stretch of all the different categories.
So Kim, when you did the exercise, did you like work your way straight through the compendium? Did you sort of read straight through, or did you already have some ideas and kind of skipped around, you know, looking for things that you were familiar with first, or did you just sort of read it cover to cover and pick out these actions that corresponded well with things that would work for American Samoa?
Well, I read through the compendium and I made note of what stood out to me and what I could relate to American Samoa. So I made sure just to look through everything, and then as I made note of things that looked like they related to American Samoa, I went back to them and then went into detail about how I could plug that in for American Samoa.
Great.
So it was helpful to go through it all and then go back. Hey, David.
Hey, what question for you also?
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering which of the strategies were the most difficult to come up for actions, or come up with actions for. If there were any that stood out as being harder to come up, you know, with anything.
Well, I like the idea of designating the large managed areas, but that was still something new to me, so it was a challenge to visualize, but at the same time, I'm glad that I was able to plug it into the connectivity portion, because it was still something that was, it was new. It was new to me. But it's, yeah, it proved to be helpful.
Yeah, that looks like it's that one has especially good coverage. Nice to see.
Yeah, you could almost make the managed areas, you know, I suppose supporting evolutionary potential could even be covered if you are particularly targeting areas with, say, a high biodiversity, or the fact that you're targeting, or if you targeted areas that are not only natural refugia, but highly biodiverse, yeah, then you could consider it as supporting diversity that would allow evolutionary potential. So the way that you use MPAs or managed areas would determine how many X's go in your strategies.
Right.
Strategies. Very cool.
All right, so I'll go ahead and move forward with going back to worksheet 1A and adding new actions. Let's see. So once you add in these new ones, there you go. So I just plugged these in to worksheet 1A, and then I plugged them into worksheet 1B. And you can see how it was revisited. Any questions about this one?
So Kim, when we didn't require that, obviously that the actions be completely run through, although that's what you would ultimately want to do. So what are some of the ways that you can imagine either the ox bile injections or the settling ponds would be affected either through the effects on their stressors or directly by climate change? These two seem to be ones that are pretty specific and you know quite a lot about since you've been using settling ponds. So do you have any thoughts about how climate change might affect, say, the effectiveness of the settling ponds in this particular location?
Right. Good question. American Samoa receives a lot of rain. So with climate change, we're expecting an increase in storms and extreme weather. So there's going to be a lot more water coming through and carrying sediment through the quarries. So a main concern is, will these settling ponds be able to withstand all this stress? And that's something that we definitely have to look into in the years to come, whether we're going to have to create more settling ponds or how are we going to need to adjust this action to make it more climate resilient, especially with we have so much rain here already, and with the anticipation of increased storms, something we have to manage and prepare for.
So up to now, when you have extreme rain events, particularly extreme ones, so far is the problem more that the settling ponds might not be able to accommodate all the sediment loads, or do you think are they sometimes actually being washed out and damaged badly, or is it a combination of both? And which do you think is where things are headed?
I foresee that both of those problems could surface with extreme weather, extreme rain events. And you know what they say, you have to just prepare for the worst. But
Right.
I think that we just have to find ways to create more ponds or just expand upon the ones we have now.
Right. And I think you said that the rock quarry owners were really on board with these settling ponds, and so you probably do have the flexibility to make those kinds of changes.
Right. There's been 2 actions taken with the quarry. They stopped washing the crushed rocks with water and cover the working roads with gravel just to stop the fine grain from washing into the stream, and building the retention ponds, the settling ponds, between the quarry and the stream, because there's that main stream that runs right by the quarry straight into the ocean. It's a stream that often overflows with the heavy rain. It's a stream that's so strong it's even caused a loss of life here because it's a very, very fast-moving stream with all the rain. So the quarry has definitely taken matters into their own hands, and they've been very cooperative with these actions.
Cool. So I'm just imagining in my head where I would be writing all these things down in these different columns, and hopefully folks on the phone can get an idea of where this one might be headed.
Yeah. So I was going to say that I was having fun thinking about the crown of thorns example for this, thinking about how primarily changes in nutrients would affect crown of thorns outbreaks, and maybe changes in ocean circulation due to,
Right.
I guess, probably changes in water temperature.
Right.
And so how that would change the frequency of outbreaks and their duration, and maybe where they're occurring, or the seasons of those, and then so how that would affect how frequently you can go out and kill a crown of thorns, how often you would need to, over what area you might need to. There's a lot of fun possibilities there.
Definitely.
And that's not something that we've thought about in the Caribbean, obviously, fortunately. There being no crown of thorns in the Caribbean yet. So that's a very new one for me.
Right on. Yeah, Kim, who are the people that go out and do these injections? Like, what kind of capacity? If you had, much bigger outbreaks, what would that mean for trying to get people out there if they're injecting one at a time?
That's just it. It's the manpower. It's a very tedious job to go out and find them and inject them. And our staff here in the Coral Reef Advisory Group have taken an active role in going out there, but also the national parks of American Samoa have been very, very crucial in controlling the crown of thorns, especially in the park area on the north shore of the island. So there are people who are trained to do this, but I could imagine that if the outbreaks continue and if they increase, a great challenge we have here is capacity to go out and eradicate them. There's still methods that we encourage, or we know that people use within the villages without the ox bile. Like, some people will literally get a large long stick and get the crown of thorns and put it out on the beach just to let them dry out, because not everyone's equipped with injections in ox bile. So people have taken matters into their own hands in some villages and have done that, where they just make sure not to touch the crown of thorns. And using what we have in American Samoa, we can be very resourceful, and using a large long stick has proven to be effective in some villages in removing the crown of thorns from the reef and putting them on the beach to dry out.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me, because when I think about, this one, and if you were to fill out all these columns, I could really see it going both ways, in the sense of how much bigger and more widespread might these outbreaks be. Maybe we're not positive, but if we think that we're pretty much on the edge of our capacity already, there could be some serious concern here about whether this method could really take care of the problem.
Right.
On the other hand, if the crown of thorns are so destructive that it needs to be a priority, then that might argue for really a big investment in this method, or at least continuing this method in combination with the other kind of cruder methods, getting more and more village participant and, volunteer participation. And maybe you could either scale back on the ox bile injections, or you might still decide that you need them in combination with everything else if it's that important, of a problem. So it seems like this information, either way, would kind of help you start to assess
what else we need to do, right? We've been researching other ways, because we always have to take the environment into consideration. We have to make sure whatever we're using is not going to damage the reef even further. So people have been looking into other ways and other natural substances that could be effective in killing the crown of thorns. So this is definitely something that would help us revisit those ideas and strategize how we could prepare for a bigger outbreak.
So maybe I can ask you, Kim, to reflect on the overall experience, reflect on these questions, but I also wanted to ask you about a question we often get for people is how much time these things take. So for the level of, the number of iterations you did, or, what was the time commitment for you to kind of begin to build this list and get an idea of how it works and do some refining? And how did that work for you, and how was the experience for you?
All right. Well, I definitely wanted to be as thorough as I could in looking over the compendium and finding the things that were relevant to American Samoa. So I would say I took about 2.5 hours, to be honest. I read over it and then read over it again and then made note of what was relevant. And then I went back and plugged it in. But I would say that looking over the compendium a couple of times and really getting a grasp of it helped me to move through the worksheets more effectively. So most of the time was spent looking over the compendium and then really asking myself, how does this relate to American Samoa? And then once I focused and found those points, then it was smooth sailing from there. But it was just a matter of taking the time to get a grasp of the compendium, and then it was a lot smoother once I had a better understanding of it. So yeah, I would say 2.5 hours.
So, and it wasn't too difficult to not only recognize those general ideas, but then kind of turn them into the specific version for your place.
Yeah, I would say once I got the general idea, then making the specific examples came a lot easier. So getting that understanding of the general idea makes it a lot smoother. So yeah, I think it was an overall good exercise because it made me think about other strategies and actions that American Samoa really needs to consider.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being our star featured.
Oh no, thank you
for today. I really appreciate it. So we're just going to take a few minutes to kind of circle back to the big picture. So here is the full flow of the tool. Congratulations, you have now explored every aspect of this, almost. You have done an activity 1 exercise. You've taken existing management actions that you were given by example, or some people might have taken their own. You've used vulnerability assessment information along with looking at those actions to try out the design considerations in worksheets 1A and 1B, and what that means for expressing a more detailed so-called climate smart version of the original action. And then most recently, you've used worksheet 2 along with both the vulnerability assessment and the compendium to see if you could brainstorm new actions that, again, you can see here, you would then iterate back to activity 1. So worksheet 2 helps you specify actions that are appropriate to fill gaps in your vulnerability coverage, and that you would then want to see benefit from being run through these design considerations. The one piece that we have not had time to focus on in this course are these 2 white bubbles, which are the supplementary output 1 and supplementary output 2. So I wanted to just take a minute or two to just give you an idea of what that's about. So as you know, all 3 of the worksheets that you've used have a notes column where you were encouraged to write down information, ideas, considerations, anything that came up. And those things fall into kind of, we have found when working with experts, 2 basic categories, one being data and information gaps and research needs, and the second one being when you start realizing that using an action might require that action has a relationship to other actions, and that it's not being used in a vacuum, and that there might be interactions with other actions. So I just want to show you a quick example. This is straight out of the user guide, so you can always go back to this in the appendix of the user guide. So I think the information gaps and research needs is pretty intuitive. And you can just take this table as an example. You could add some different column headings or some additional column headings. But this is a place where you could sort of pluck all the information that is scattered across worksheet 1A, 1B, and worksheet 2 even, that has to do with questions that you have about information that's missing. It might be information that is possible to go get, and some of it might be information that does not yet exist and would need to be kind of sent along the research track. But these are just some examples. If we look at this Guanica Bay example of switching from sun-grown to shade-grown coffee, because shade-grown coffee can tolerate shade, it's possible to grow it interspersed with understory plants as well as upperstory canopy plants, which then keep the soil much better stabilized. And so that makes problems with erosion and sediment runoff in particular less of a problem. So with our Guanica Bay partners, here are just some examples of some questions that they wanted to make sure that they recorded for this action. Things having to do with understanding watershed processes better, both historical and current, and also moving into the future. What is it that we know about the drought tolerance, for instance, of shade-grown coffee plants, but also I would say the shade plants that you're going to be using to grow them under. How are climate drivers, column 4, relevant here? What do we know about projected increases in wind speeds? That can be really important for desiccation as well as physical stress. What will be changes in circulation patterns? Since this is all a problem for reefs, what do we know about sediment delivery to reefs, and what is even our target of how much sediment needs to be reduced, and how do we think about whether this strategy by itself or with others would be sufficient from a coral reef perspective? Moving on, column 5, climate change effects on the stressors of concern. In Guanica Bay, they wanted to do a geospatial analysis to look at where flooding in the valley could be documented. That might be important for targeting where you want to focus on this first to try to implement it. And then understanding the stressor effects on the biota in question. We need to understand sensitivity of reef species, and we also need to understand the sensitivity of the shade-grown coffee and the forests and the canopy plants and the understory plants. If those plants are not going to be surviving well, then this strategy, this action might change in its functionality in the future as we have more extreme events and droughts and stressors. So one question was, what is even known about the effects of stressors on these plants? And then what does all this mean for climate change effects on the effectiveness of the action? Well, we don't even know, how big an area we need to have stabilized to cut down on the sediment loads, for instance. So one of the things that I'm kind of thinking about, that if anybody has any reflections on, is it necessary to fill this kind of thing out action by action, or is it possible to just summarize a bunch of questions across all the actions that you've considered? In the one case, it would be good to not have a lot of repetitiveness, where some actions you might have the same questions in these columns, but at the same time, if you're focusing on a particular action, you might want to focus just on the research questions for that action. So it's one of the things I'm kind of debating, and maybe it might be useful for us to provide an example where we've just refined down to a key set of research questions, for instance, that are needed for the Guanica Bay watershed, that are common questions that apply to many actions. For supplementary output 2, now this is the one that has to do with analyzing, sequencing, and interaction. So here's what this worksheet looks like. What can come up in discussion as people are working through an action is, since no action is occurring in a vacuum, it is occurring in the context of other activities, often it'll start to pop up that there are some considerations that are important. So here again is the switching to sun-grown shade, from sun-grown to shade-grown coffee example. So the climate smart version is planting shade-tolerant coffee and heat-tolerant shade plants, and using understory and secondary canopy plants that will effectively use or provide nutrients and will stabilize soil during intense storms. So since when we select the final priority actions for a plan, we're selecting a combination of things that we hope will be effective. Interdependencies among certain activities can be really important. Our Guanica partners emphasize that they would need to do a farm inventory in order to identify where the best place would be to implement this action, especially at first. The redundancy question is, of course, if you are using shade-grown coffee that can tolerate a shady, stabilizing canopy, that is mutually exclusive to growing non-shade tolerant coffee, the regular coffee, and using cover crops. So another technique is to, in between coffee crops, plant cover crops to stabilize the soil. So those things are mutually exclusive actions, and if one were to run cover crops, which folks are doing through the tool, then it might be possible to compare the relative effectiveness of these two actions relative to each other, and that might have some effects on which are chosen in particular locations for particular reasons. And then they felt that there was a synergetic relationship, a positive synergy with treatments and standards for dirt roads that run along these coffee farms, that if you were to implement the shade-grown coffee in combination with smart road treatments and standards, that those two things together could together have a greater effect than either one by itself, or at least would be additive with each other, so that together they might accomplish the total amount of sediment reduction necessary, where neither one by itself would be enough. They felt, in terms of column 5 sequencing, that it's possible to go ahead and be implementing shade-grown coffee, but that simultaneously they wanted to get on top of this farm inventory to assist in prioritization of where to do the next conversions, and to also simultaneously be working on the dirt road standard. So it seemed like all three of those activities needed to be done urgently and in parallel, as opposed to some kind of linear sequence. So that's the example, and the notes just sort of puts into narrative some of these questions that are in here, and does bring up other questions about best management practices, and how maybe this use of this action, does that require that we look at some different best management practices, including for things like fertilizers and pesticides and herbicide applications. So there we are. Those are the purposes of these optional supplementary output worksheets. So why are those helpful? So here we are. We're back at our overall climate smart cycle that you saw at the beginning of the course. we have been focusing on this step 4, which is identifying / brainstorming adaptation options. They can't really be considered true adaptation and actions until they've been subjected to the climate smart design consideration. So that's why this tool was sort of developed with that step in mind originally. Now, the purpose was to generate a large list of climate smart ideas so that as we move into step 5, you can evaluate and select your final group of priority actions, hopefully in a better informed, more rigorous, climate smart way. So especially that supplementary output 2, where you're beginning to think about how actions interact with each other, that can help as you move between a big list of actions and trying to come to grips with how you're going to evaluate and select a smaller set. One of the next steps of this project that we're considering is examining and examining how folks are currently going about this evaluation and selection process. What are the methods, either formal or informal, that people are using to take a potentially large list of ideas and decide what they're actually going to prioritize first? Can we demonstrate how the outputs from this tool and from these supplementary output worksheets can help inform that process? So that's one of the things that is the purpose of the tool, is to help inform that, and that we hope to look at next. But one of the things we realized with working with people in different settings using the tool is that the tool actually informs pretty much every other step of the cycle, not just step 5. For instance, we have mentioned in the course lessons that once folks have selected priority actions, they are interested in going back to the tool and further refining into greater and greater detail the answers to those questions in the columns. So David Gibbs, who is an ORISE fellow with us, has been doing a project with subject matter experts in Puerto Rico to take a couple of selected actions, bring in experts on those specific actions, and do what we call a deep cut on these actions, with the goal being to develop more detailed information that could then flow into an implementation plan. So there's another thing that David's working on that we're really interested in, is how far can you take the tool into detail, and then what does it look like to take that information and reorganize it into the standard form of, well, what are the decisions that need to be made and the steps for implementing the action in the climate smart way. The information in the tool also relates to step 7. You might recall that in worksheet 1A, there's a column that asks that question about what are your management targets, what are the metrics that you're going to use to measure effectiveness, and how might climate change affect the way you measure them. Well, identifying what are going to be your indicators or metrics that you're going to use to measure success will directly, hopefully, inform or prepare you for step 7. Because the goal is, after implementation, to then be tracking and evaluating the success so that one can continue to make improvements through time. Now, it works the other way as well. We can use the information on supplementary output 1, which is the information gaps and research needs, that often contains a lot of questions about climate impacts and vulnerabilities and unknowns that the person using the tool needs to know more about to really get firm and solid with some of the design considerations. Sometimes that means going back and finding existing vulnerability information that just hasn't been located or hasn't been put into the right form. But it also can mean that you've identified a real research need that the research community needs to know about. And I really feel like very strongly that we need to be giving that feedback back to those who are generating climate vulnerability and resilience information, give them the feedback of what information and what form of information is still needed. And sometimes when the design of an action might require that you move into another jurisdiction, that you, like if you're thinking of large marine protected areas or connectivity of areas, it might take you outside of your range of current jurisdiction of your plan. Or looking at the climate smart design of an action might make you realize that it may not even be possible to meet the objective, the original objective of that action. And in that case, that might send you back to step 3 to really review and revise, if necessary, goals and objectives of your plan. So that's the big picture. And we hope that the value added in using the tool beyond that thought process that we've been working on with these exercises is that when you're all finished, you have a set of information that was arrived at in a structured, systematic way, and a way that helps further clarify something that's a very complicated thought process. And it does that in a transparent way. It records it so that anybody coming or going from the program or anybody coming in can see the thought process by which a program or a decision has arrived at its current status. And this can really help lend credibility to decisions because there's a logical and defensible thought process behind it that can be shown. The tool helps look at uncertainty without being paralyzed by it. So there's a lot of unknowns and a lot of uncertainty, and the tool explicitly asks for you to make a note of what the uncertainties are and their degree, but encourages just marching through that thought process and being prepared with the understanding that as information improves and as the knowledge base improves, we may be able to reduce some of the uncertainties and go back and improve the information. So again, having that recorded in a way that allows you to continually go back and improve is really useful to people. It supports consideration of spatial and temporal scales. There are questions that explicitly ask about temporal sequencing and bring up some of these issues of relationships among actions and, of course, the scale at which climate change is occurring versus the scale at which you need to do action. And we are also finding that it provides a practical basis for folks who then want to go back to thinking about their higher level strategic planning. Because after all, a strategic plan, its goals and objectives are met through specific activities. And so to the degree that you can assess the ability of your specific activities to be climate smart, that's going to give you feedback on whether you can meet your own strategy or whether certain parts of your strategy need to go away or new parts need to be brought in, or whether just a reprioritization of what aspects of the strategy are strongest